Thank you very much. I'm glad that you finally received the file. Hello, everybody. My name is Sandra. I am presenting from Melbourne in Australia. Can you please move to the next slide? And the title of my presentation is Using the Elements of Local Culture to Innovate Traditional Cuisines. This pertains to my PhD thesis that was about the new Peruvian gastronomic discourse. Can you please move one slide? Since I'm presenting for Melbourne, I would like to make an acknowledgement of country. On behalf of this presentation, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri people of the land in which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. Next slide, please. So this is a general outline of the presentation today. There is a little bit of a context regarding Peruvian gastronomy, the objective of the research, the methodology, the findings, and recommendations. Next slide, please. One more. So when we think about Peru, usually the first thing that comes into our heads will be Machu Picchu. Machu Picchu is the main attraction in the country, and it has been the place where people continue to go to Peru for Machu Picchu. Now, in the past 20 years, other cultural elements of the country have started to take importance, one of them being the local gastronomy. Changes that resulted in the introduction of local gastronomy were related to the steady economic growth of the country and collaborative approaches by the government, private institutions, and interestingly, a group of local chefs. Peruvian gastronomy has become a tool for economic and social development. Some have called it a revolution, while others refer to it as a significant food movement. And can we move to the next slide, please? So Peru, as a result of these changes, Peru has gained international recognition as a gastronomic destination, getting the title of world leading culinary destination since 2012 until last year, 2019. The Peruvian government has also used this opportunity to create a brand that promotes tourism and also promotes the exportation of traditional food products. Next slide, please. So how all of this happened? Well, as mentioned before, changes were mainly driven by local chefs. These local chefs opened restaurants that will combine elements of innovation and local traditions. Some of these chefs are involved in research projects that aim to protect food items or particular cultural elements of food. They have also created NGOs because they seek to extend the benefits of the popularity of Peruvian gastronomy to poorer sectors. For example, through the creation of a cooking school for underprivileged students. Next slide, please. Now, in order to understand the significance of the changes in the Peruvian gastronomy, we need to take a step back and look at the historical development of the local gastronomy. Peruvian gastronomy is based on the country biodiversity, fusion of native culinary heritage and external influences, and a wide variety of food traditions and practices in different regions. Despite of all of this, traditional Peruvian food was generally perceived as low quality, and the consumption was limited at home. Before the changes in Peruvian gastronomy, touristic restaurants and fine dining will be mainly dedicated to serve French or Italian cuisine. Now, the origins of the Peruvian gastronomy started in the pre-Inca times through the domestication of popular food items that we consume today, such as the potato, the quinoa, and the maize. Later, the Incas conducted agricultural experimentations. These are called the Andenes, which we can see a picture over there. During the pre-Inca and the Inca time, the diet of the elite groups and the general population was similar. Food items will differ in quality as well as quantity. Next slide, please. Now, with the advent of the Spanish colonizers in 1532, it started the first influence in Peruvian gastronomy. The colonizers used food as a cultural element for putting social, political, and economic order in the colonies. Now, they were interested to maintain a supply of familiar food because that familiar food will allow them to preserve the differences from the indigenous people, but at the same time was used to make indigenous more similar to the Europeans under the notion of more civilized. Cultivation of indigenous products started to decline, and the indigenous changed their diet. And it started to begin with the first emergence of the hybrid culinary system. Many indigenous females cooked at the Spanish households, and they started to add or to incorporate, for example, in soups, garlic and onion. When the Spanish came at the same time, later arrived the Africans. They came as slaves to the country, and they, similar to the indigenous, they started to work in the households as servants. And many times they were replacing the indigenous people because they have better disposition to serve the colonizers. Afro-Peruvians contributed to the creation of what is now known as the criolla cuisine, which is a cuisine widely consumed in the country. Next slide, please. Later, there were three main influences in Peruvian gastronomy: Italians that came for business to Peru, Chinese that came to work instead of the slaves, and a new type of restaurant was created called chifa. It's a Chinese Peruvian food. Later, the Japanese also arrived to the country, and in 1970, we start to see Nikkei restaurants. Through the influence of the Japanese, Peruvian cuisine started to incorporate rice vinegar, miso, wasabi, and so on. So each of these groups came at different times, and the high adaptability of local cuisine allowed the creation of these hybrids that were maintained at the households. And next slide, please. So the objective of the research I conduct was to investigate what is the role of Peruvian chefs in the development and the promotion of local gastronomy. Next slide, please. The Peruvian chefs that started this movement of that changed the Peruvian gastronomy had certain characteristics. The main characteristic was that they had the possibility to study and or work abroad. They belong to the medium to upper socioeconomic class. They have received secondary enculturation because they were in contact or live abroad with other cultures, and they also have multicultural skills. They managed to retain their original culture, and they incorporated external cultural settings. For many of these chefs, one of the reasons why they returned to the country is because they said, I'm Peruvian, I needed to come back. Next slide, please. And one more. So this research was a qualitative research. What I use is a narrative inquiry. The reason why is because a narrative inquiry will allow us an understanding about the individuals when processes of social and cultural changes take place. In-depth interviews were conducted with local chefs, and I collected detailed stories from the life of a small number of individuals within this specific situation. I also conducted participant observation. Many of these interviews were conducted, not all of the interviews, sorry, were conducted in Spanish and then translated to English. Next slide, please. The fieldwork took place in two cities, in Lima, because it's the capital of the country and the main port of entry, and in Cusco, because that's one of the most important touristic cities of Peru, if not the most important. And in these two places, there is a great variety of restaurants. Next slide, please. And one more. What did I find? I found that chefs will fulfill two functions. They will seek cultural preservation, and at the same time, they will incorporate innovation. The cultural preservation, they claim that Peru has an established culinary system that was the foundation that supported the rise of the diverse versions of Peruvian cuisine. agricultural achievements, the biodiversity, the external influence I just mentioned it before, were recognized and incorporated in the discourse. They basically refer to the cuisine as a living identity. And they also mention about the intervention of local people. They said local people has maintained that know-how that has been transferred through generations and preserved in local households. And they also mentioned the fact that Peruvians are very passionate about food and they also like very much eating. In the side of the innovation, they incorporated new techniques and new different combinations. They used their creativity, and some of them provided interpretation of local dishes. Previous literature has identified that the period of professional cuisines are characterized by the complex steps in production. Next slide, please. So changes implemented to dishes had a direct relationship to the location of these chefs in other cultures and also in their work environment. Those with greater exposure to foreign forms performed major variations in local gastronomy. They were denominated initiators of high cuisine. The degree of changes descended as certain chefs educated abroad decided to combine certain aspects of culinary traditions alongside the foreign techniques. They are considered as interpreters. The next level were chefs that either decided to stay in the country or went abroad with the sole purpose of education. They were considered as the keepers of traditional cuisine. And the last level, those were the chefs that performed innovations or changes as a result of their locality. They have restaurants in the touristic city of Cusco. The majority of chefs in this category were the ones in Cusco. Next slide, please. So the initiators of local cuisine were mainly located in the capital city. Their restaurants have received local and international recognitions. Their cuisines are very particular because they only include native ingredients, and they do it using foreign techniques. They don't use typical dishes. They develop signature culinary productions that represents their individuality as chefs. Next slide, please. The next category, we have interpreters. Interpreters have transformed traditional cuisine into a modern concept, yet in a different way than the previous category. Elements that have been transformed is a presentation of the dishes, for example, reduced portion size, and the restaurant where these dishes are presented. Local culinary culture is maintained, including flavors, ingredients, and some iconic Peruvian dishes. Next slide, please. The keepers of traditional cuisine considered that changes were necessary. They said, yes, Peruvian food or Peruvian cuisine needed to change, but they also think that preservation of the culinary heritage is equally important. Restaurants are used as means to communicate history and tradition. Each of these chefs will focus in a particular cuisine. For example, Indian cuisine or Nikkei cuisine, or they are seeking to bring value to regional cuisines. And next slide, please. Then the last category were the innovators of change. As mentioned before, they were located in Cusco. These chefs did not have the opportunity to go abroad. They received secondary acculturation through the exposure to a foreign culture, and they hold a position of power in the restaurant sector. Cusco is the most important touristic city. So they have received that enculturation by living there. They will consider themselves as leaders, which is slightly different than the three categories before, because the three categories before tend to be sanctioned by local people. The innovators of change, their clientele is mainly international tourists. The changes that they have made is in seasoning and presentation. In their menu, they will incorporate pizza, they will incorporate pasta, hamburgers. Still, they use certain traditional dishes. For example, in the picture, we can see a guinea pig, okay, which is a delicacy in the Indian cuisine. So they present it that way so that the tourists can take pictures, because many tourists go to Cusco to try guinea pig, and then they take it back to the kitchen, they cut it, and then they serve it in the plates. Next slide, please. So what were the recommendations the main purpose of this was to identify what was the role of these people, these chefs in particular. So it is important when initiatives are going to be created and managed by local people. The intervention of local chefs has provided a destination with distinctive advantages, and this is commonly used for tourism promotions. Their identity as Peruvians is employed to provide authority to their discourse to foreign audiences. Now, restaurants are mainly concentrated in 2 of the major touristic cities. And some of these restaurants that they have created might not be accessible for the local clientele. The second item over there, the creation of different versions of local cuisine have served to enrich the range of gastronomic cultures within the country. Peru now has a professional cuisine. And lastly, the involvement of these people has allowed the integration of the supply chain to address notions of sustainability. These chefs have extended beyond their restaurants into creative initiatives that will directly support farmers and fishermen. They have opened institutions dedicated to gastronomy and gastronomic research. Their contribution has not reached yet national scale, but it represents the beginning on the organization of diverse aspects of local food production and distribution. Next slide, please. Still, the notion of Peru as a gastronomic destination has mainly benefited restaurants in the capital. The reason why is because tourists have decided to stay longer in Lima. Chefs in Cusco will argue that the new professional cuisine has continued to preserve the cultural and economic economy of Lima. Traditional ceremonies and particular traditions associated with certain ingredients have been omitted in this gastronomic discourse, and that's one of the main things that people tend to mention. And the widespread geographical nature of rural areas where the majority of the producers are located has created difficulties in generating a consistent supply chain. As a result of that, in Lima, they have partnered into associations and organizations so they can get the native product that distinguish those particular cuisines. In Cusco, it's different because they are located in the regional area, so they have access to fresh and seasonal product. Next slide, please. So the road ahead, what is it? What is it for Peru or other destinations? The model of innovation and tradition could serve other destinations that seeks to generate different gastronomic discourses. Particularly important for the case of developing countries such as Peru that have a rich culinary heritage, but food is not used for tourism promotion. More importantly, involvement of local people is essential in the production, preparation, and promotion of these culinary experiences if the country is to get some economics and social benefits. This type of, the model I just presented could serve to design promotional strategies to address international tourists interested in learning about local culture through food. The intervention of these chefs have served not only to educate foreigners in regards to food, but also local people, because they're focusing on the nutritional value of the ingredients. Peru might be considered as a gastronomic destination, but many of the chefs pointed that there's still a lot of work to do. And lastly, the regulation of networks will require national, regional, and local governance in order to maximize the development of sustainable food systems. Peru is a developing country, where contribution from the government is still low. There is a lack of clusters for recollection of products or distribution systems. As mentioned before, these chefs have started to make some advancements in that area, but it is very important if other destinations want to incorporate gastronomy as part of their tourism product, that more collaboration comes from the government. Next slide, please. Thank you very much for your attention. Do you have any questions?
a question on there talking about the gastronomy of Peru and a little more about maybe examples of, besides just food, what the gastronomy of the cuisine of Peru would include, and any examples of kind of how it's fusion cuisine in Peru.
Well, there's all these different influences have created different fusion cuisines. So we have the chifas, where you go there and there is no so much you won't recognize the Chinese food. It's more about the Chinese Peruvian or the Peruvian Nikkei food. So Peruvian gastronomy is very much a big fusion of external influences. And
perfect. Is there anything beyond the food as well, whether that be any particular dining culture or any beverages that are?
Yes, certainly. Peru has a variety of culinary traditions. There is the tradition of drinking chicha, which is fermented corn, and is mainly used in the lower socioeconomic stratus, but certain attempts in the country have seek to make chicha a more sophisticated product for the tourists, for example. And of course, we have the pisco. Pisco sour, some of the attendees maybe have tried. That's the national drink of Peru. It's like by law, it's the national drink of Peru. But we are still fighting with Chile in regards of who makes the best, who makes and produce the best pisco.
That sounds great. One thing you brought up, which I thought was especially interesting, is in our own countries, we realize all the influences that influence our local cuisine. So I know in America, the influence of Italian food and Chinese food, et cetera. But when we travel, I think you brought up something very important, is we think when I go to Peru, I eat only Peruvian food. Or if I go to Spain, I eat only Spanish food, or go to Sweden, eat only Swedish food, right? And as visitors, we want, this, what our stereotypes are to confirm. And I think I liked a lot of the way you have shown how different, immigrants to the country have influenced the cuisine of your country.
Certainly.
I have one other quick question here for you. And you said, I love the quote, this is my favorite quote, is that cuisine as a living entity. I love the idea that it's this living culture. Are there any chefs or restaurants that are doing a good job of communicating this history to their visitors, to their diners?
It will be through the keepers of traditional cuisine. For example, a chef called Solórzano, he does research, and he and his mother published books about the culinary traditions in regional areas. As I said before, many of the restaurants have focused on their own creations, but the keepers are the ones that are trying to maintain those traditions, to communicate those traditions. And even particularly when tourists go to those restaurants, they receive information about where the dishes come from, or how the dishes are prepared, and what ingredients are used.
Perfect. Yeah, I think that's such a great thing in education, is actually be able to teach the traveler accidentally while they're there. And I have one last question for you. I think we have about 1 minute left. Are there any places in the world where there are excellent examples of Peruvian cuisine outside of Peru? I know in London there's some good Peruvian cuisine, but are there any other cities that you would think of that have a lot of great Peruvian foods?
Well, being Peruvian, for me, no restaurants outside Peru will serve that same quality of food. But yes, there have been attempts of opening Peruvian restaurants, particularly from these chefs that I interview for my research. They have opened in different restaurants around the world. One of the main, let's call it, main things that will stop a restaurant being a good Peruvian restaurant will be the availability of the products. So, for example, for making Peruvian cuisine, you need a particular type of chili, which is like the DNA of all Peruvian dishes. And many of the chefs have mentioned that without that, or without that particular Peruvian ingredients, it's very hard to replicate the Peruvian cuisine.
Perfect. And I have one question, about 1 minute for this final question. In your research, what elements could you distinguish that were most important in the relationship between chefs and local producers or local farmers? So what elements are most important to that relationship?
Well, it was through history, native people or indigenous people has been relegated. They belong to the poorer sectors. The initiatives that these chefs have incorporated have sought, they are focused very much into recognizing indigenous people as the ones that have maintained these products or know the know-how. So that has, it perhaps is one of the first times that in Peruvian history, indigenous culture, food has been incorporated into the national discourse and has been recognized by the value, which is quite important. Yet still much work is needed.
Thank you so much for the presentation.
Thank you.
So if everybody can just close out of this window. Each session will be recorded separately. So just close out of this window, go back to your original link and click on that link and you'll be in another room ready for the next presentation. Thank you so much.
Yes, and Shritha, who is speaking next, if you could check your email for the admin link. What we've done is add all presenters now to the admin panel to allow you to be able to share your screen. So it was something that we didn't know that we needed to do because this is a new software for us. So hopefully this problem has now been solved. So thank you all for this. And we'll look forward to seeing you again in a couple minutes for the next session.